Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and you are listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Greg Levine. Greg is a partner with the law firm Sidley Austin, and you work, Greg, in the energy and infrastructure area. I'll let you tell a little bit more about exactly what you do and what the firm is involved in.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm really excited to be here. Yep, I'm a partner in our New York office at Sidley Austin. I kind of started off my career as a project finance lawyer, working on all sorts of different types of power and infrastructure projects. But for the past decade or so, I've really been focused on renewable energy in particular. And as that market has evolved, that's extended to energy transition types of assets, as well as different types of infrastructure investments.
The reason I wanted to have you on the program today is to talk about President Trump's administration. He's coming up on his 100 days in office. I kind of want to talk about the changes that he has made since coming into his second term in the presidency. And there's been quite a few that are significant. Obviously, he's signed some executive orders that affect the industry. What do you see as probably the most impactful actions that his administration has taken in this second term?
So I think that there are, well, let me put it this way. The Trump administration has taken an everything all the time approach. And so it is somewhat difficult to narrow down exactly what the most impactful things are going to be. But there is one thing in particular, and I have a follow up, but there's one thing in particular that I think would be hard to argue is not the most impactful, and that's the current status of tariffs and a potential trade war. It has been my experience in speaking with my clients and kind of seeing how their businesses have evolved over the past decade that supply chain is absolutely critical to their ability to execute on developing important infrastructure assets and energy assets. Now, I don't have a strong view on whether the goals of the Trump administration in instituting this trade war are laudable or not. But I do know that it is extremely impactful on the ability of our clients to execute on their business on a day-to-day basis. One of the things that you hear all the time when talking to both financing parties and developers is how much certainty do we have in our ability to execute? During the first batch of major tariffs on solar panels, for example, there was pretty significant disruption over a pretty significant amount of time as these businesses had to step back, reevaluate their supply chain, reevaluate their cost structures, reprice power purchase contracts, and try to figure out how they were going to operate in the commercial environment that they were in. And those types of changes take time to absorb and also require some level of certainty about, if I do absorb these changes, is this my new reality? And so I think for that reason, more than anything else, more than any of the energy independence proclamations or more than any stated position on what types of energy we want to have in this country, having a level of certainty about the costs and ability to execute is critically important.
And these tariffs are pretty widespread. I mean, it's basically affecting everywhere from the European Union to Canada and Mexico to China. Are there specific countries that you feel are most impactful toward your clients and to, developers in the US?
I would say that I'm not sophisticated enough to understand the complexities of the supply chain because, for example, I saw a letter from Representative Chris Smith from New Jersey making negative statements, we'll say, about some of the offshore wind developments on the eastern seaboard. And one of the things that he noted was that one of the big offshore wind developments had turbine disruption, had damage to a turbine, and some of these turbines and some of these parts were made in Canada, and some were made in other parts of the global economy, which seemed to indicate to me that there's a little bit of nationalism going on in our analysis of how these projects are viewed in today's political environment. It certainly is true that so much of our battery supply chain and so much of our solar supply chain comes from Southeast Asia. And so significant tariffs on product coming in from those countries is going to dramatically impact our ability to execute on those projects in the United States. It is also true that restrictions on exports of rare earth materials, which is some that's a phrase that I don't think was in the public lexicon until a few months ago, but export limitations on those materials are also going to have a huge impact on our ability to domesticate a supply chain or create some more resiliency across our supply chain. So it clearly will have an impact one way or the other. And the question is just whether we can evolve and domesticate some of that supply chain in a way that doesn't cause significant disruption in the short term, and whether it's possible to have a path forward in the short to medium term.
And since you mentioned wind farms, President Trump has been somewhat outspoken against wind in the past. How has that affected your clients? Is there hesitancy to invest in wind projects at this point in time while he's in office, or what have you seen and heard from them?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because my second biggest impact of in the first 100 days would certainly be the proclamations pausing evaluation of permitting of renewable projects, but particularly wind projects on federal lands. That is having real world impacts today on the offshore wind market off the eastern seaboard of the United States. As I'm sure you and many of the listeners of the podcast saw, the Department of Interior through BOEM issued a stop work order on the Empire Wind project, which is being developed by Equinor off the coast of New York and New Jersey. One of the things that has been discussed about the impact of the Trump administration's plans for wind development or energy development on any federal lands is that, well, it seems unlikely that there's going to be an impedance on projects that have already achieved financial close or already have commercial parties that are really committed based on the federal government's existing approvals of these projects. And I think this is the first example of a major infrastructure investment. I mean, all the offshore wind projects off the eastern seaboard cost billions, if not tens of billions of dollars each. It's the first example of a project that has actually been stopped in its tracks while the Trump administration reevaluates whether it believes that these projects are in the best interest of the country. So again, no matter what side of the spectrum you are on, whether you're supportive of wind or not supportive of wind, these changes are having major capital implications on the ability of all these companies are transglobal developers of power. It's going to have a massive impact on the attractiveness of pursuing these existing strategies in the United States. There's no way it couldn't.
Are most of your clients in the renewables area, or do you work with some fossil fuel clients as well?
Our client base in our energy and infrastructure practice here, and this is reflective of my own practice as well, we represent some major global developers. The ones that I work with certainly have a renewable energy component to them, but we work with plenty of developers who are looking to develop and own assets across the energy spectrum. So whether that's natural gas or whether that's renewables or whether that's nuclear, these clients are energy clients that look at a multi-pronged strategy for how they're going to contribute to the energy marketplace in the United States.
Mhm.
We also work for a lot of funds, private capital, private equity, that are similarly somewhat agnostic as to the types of investments they're making, as long as there is a strategic reason to be involved in making investments in those assets. And so that certainly covers the gamut of renewables, natural gas, clean fuels investments, but it also covers, some of the other things that are driving a lot of changes in our marketplace today, like data center investments, recycling facilities. Some have made investments in green hydrogen, and we can talk about that if you want to. I think
Mhm.
that market has a lot of headwinds right now. Sustainable aviation fuel. All these things make up the energy mix in the United States, and our clients are looking at all of them and trying to figure out what the best strategic pathway to deploy their capital is.
I'm guessing they take a long-term view. So, I mean, they're looking out, maybe 5, 10 years. And obviously, the Trump administration has made changes. You mentioned the pausing of leases for wind farms on federal land. They've also kind of ended a moratorium on new coal leasing on federal land. So they're trying to boost coal production and kind of limit some of the renewables development that's underway. I would think the clients that you may work with probably have to think, well, what's going to happen once Trump leaves office? And think about where they want to put their money. Are they having trouble delineating which way to go, or do they kind of have the idea that the renewables are still coming and it's just maybe slowed that development down a little bit by a few years? What's your take?
That's an interesting point, Aaron. We had some really fantastic conversations in the first half of this year trying to understand exactly that point. And one of the things that bubbled up in all of the conversations we had with our clients was that renewables as an asset class are not attractive to investors because the government was supporting or not supporting them. That may have been the case 10, 20, 30 years ago. But today, there is no other energy asset that can be deployed from scratch in the time frame that you can deploy, for example, a solar plus battery project. There is no other energy asset that has as low, I'm not saying there's no externalities, but as low externalities to the human population as renewable energy assets. And frankly, from a cost perspective, even if you factor in some increased tariffs, the price of building new solar and batteries, for example, is extremely cost competitive. And I found it very interesting that a lot of our clients who represent private equity, private capital, banks, and sponsors said this is sort of a great time to be in this business because I can actually advocate with a straight face for making investments in these assets, notwithstanding whether we're in a pro green environment economy or whether we're in a, everything goes economy. They make sense economically and they're able to be executed on in a time frame that you just can't execute on new traditional energy assets. That's one part of the story. It's interesting to me that when you talk to the manufacturers of traditional like natural gas turbines, for example, their sales lists are sold out for the next 5 or 6 years. It takes 5 to 8 years to build one of those new facilities. Certainly, there's been a lot of talk about nuclear recently. I think it would be great to see more nuclear development, but those are on a 10 to 12 year life cycle for designing and constructing those types of assets. So you can kind of look at all of these different choices that we have in this country and globally for how and what you're going to choose to put your capital into and how what you're going to choose to develop. But there are just some economic facts that make it a very safe bet still, I think, to continue to develop renewables.
Part of the impetus behind development of renewables is the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the money that was allocated toward clean electricity investment credits, for example, and helping projects, basically become more financeable, I would say, and more viable economically. Do you see any changes coming in that respect? I mean, do you think there will be a rollback of some of these credits or a reduction, or money shifted away from the IRA in any way? going forward?
Well, money being shifted away from the IRA, certainly, as we've already seen with some of the changes in some of the DOE loan guarantee programs and some of the grant programs. My sense is that the administration is evaluating whether any of those programs have utility for what their goals are right now. When it comes to the tax credits, though, at least in the short term, we have not heard any indications that any of those programs are at risk. And at least certainly that appears to be in part to several important economic advisors to the president and the administration who are strongly in support of finding ways to use private capital to create energy investments in the United States. And one of the strengths of the investment tax credit and the production tax credit and transferability has certainly been that you can leverage private capital in ways that are not as easy if you were using other economic strategies in order to encourage energy investments in this country. And so I have heard many of Trump's surrogates, kind of make that argument. I understand that's part of Scott Bessent's view of the world as well. And so I think there's a lot of good reasons today to feel confident about those programs staying in place. I think the open question is just whether those voices are able to stay in the administration for long enough and they're not replaced with other voices that have a different view. But that certainly appears to be the case for now.
And one of the first things that President Trump did when he entered office the second time here was declare a national energy emergency. What's your feeling on that? Are we really in an energy emergency, or was that just kind of rhetoric that was meant to generate some sort of an uproar around the state of the energy system?
The term energy emergency feels very political, but at the same time, it is clear to me, and seems clear to the administration and clear to a lot of the global investors who we talk to, that there are other countries like China, like India, and even Canada to some extent, who are taking steps to figure out how to lower the cost of electricity in their countries, presumably because there's a major load growth opportunity through data centers and AI and electrification that could put this country at an economic disadvantage. If we are not smart enough when it comes to our investments to make sure that we have the pipeline and we have the ability to execute on the type of power demands that we think we might need, we will lose in the competitive race with a country like China, where they can institute top-down economic management and just say, guess what? We're building 100 new nuclear power plants over the next 15 years, and the economy is going to align, and we're going to do that, and we're going to lower the cost, per megawatt of that power, and we're going to have abundant power where there aren't going to be restrictions on our ability to prioritize the things that we believe might be important to prioritize over the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's a domestic security issue that I think that we need to address holistically as a country. I don't really have much of a view on how best to address that. It certainly seems prudent to have a diversity of solutions to make sure that we are able to compete on a global basis when it comes to our domestic power production.
And I've heard a lot of people say that we need more infrastructure. We need to improve our transmission and distribution system and add new lines and increase capacity. And then I've had other people and other experts tell me that we've got plenty of capacity out there, and we're already overbuilt, and may not be as big a need as people think. What's your view on that? Do you see a lot of investment need in infrastructure such as T&D?
That's another very very complicated question. So I have a few points of view on this. One, I've had similar conversations to you, Aaron. I was at Platts last week and spoke with a number of industry participants who expressed to me the sentiment that we have tons of capacity, and if we could just be slightly more efficient with 1% of it, we actually could reduce all of the new transmission and distribution demands overnight. And that appears to be a software problem. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not an electrical engineer. I don't run a major utility, but it's an interesting use case. And it certainly is interesting as we develop more capabilities in our software analysis, in our ability to modernize the grid from an execution standpoint, not just a we need to run more wires to more places perspective. That's one thing to consider that I don't have the expertise to really evaluate, but it's an interesting thing that I think should be investigated. But two, I've seen all of the Department of Energy plans for how they hoped that we would be able to increase transmission by using an eastern seaboard offshore wind network to actually move power on and off of transmission lines that run along the seaboard out in the ocean. And that was designed to be a significant unburdening of the onshore transmission, and notably, I think, would create much more energy independence because we would be less reliant on power coming through transmission lines out of Canada. Again, I don't know what the right national security imperatives are for these things, but I find it interesting that there have been deep studies done to understand how these different pieces of our infrastructure can and should work. Separate from all of that, I think it's really amazing that some of our best energy developers have been able to go to market with new strategies that tie generation with new transmission lines into major metropolitan areas across the country that unlock development potential that didn't already exist. And just to give one example, a pattern has been extremely successful in figuring out the business use case for developing new transmission lines into Southern California and finding great opportunities to develop very, very large scale renewable energy deployments significantly outside of those areas, but able to create a lot more resiliency and reduce the cost of power in those markets. So it's a mixed bag, just like everything is in our energy markets. I think every region and maybe every sub region probably have different use cases and different opportunity sets that we have some really, really smart and enterprising talent at these energy companies across the United States that are going to find those opportunities and they're going to act on them. And I think the fourth component in all of this is I want to say probably two-thirds conservatively of the projects or businesses that I've worked with over the past year have some sort of battery component to their assets. It is clear that there is a huge economic opportunity to smooth out the generation profile of intermittent assets by adding a battery to the system. And we're seeing very creative and impactful ways, coordination with local utilities, creating new use cases to help smooth out some of the problems that you normally see with intermittency and help smooth out just some of the load demands, whether or not the generation source is renewable or not. So there's clearly a lot of opportunity to provide utility demand resource management and the like by building these new batteries, and even more when you tie them with generation.
There's been a lot of manufacturing reshored to the U.S., and that started years ago, and these projects have continued through Biden administration, and now, of course, President Trump's administration is encouraging that as well. Do you think the America First agenda and this growth in domestic manufacturing will continue? Will we continue to see projects where the manufacturing is brought back to the U.S. and more domestic content continues to be used in these projects going forward?
My greatest hope is that the outcome of this administration's trade policy and domestic manufacturing policy is that we are able to build significant advanced manufacturing capabilities in the United States. I have so little insight into how you might do that from a global macro perspective beyond just the varying different perspectives I've heard about and read in the news, but I think it is, again, from a energy security and a domestic security perspective, onshoring of sophisticated manufacturing and core infrastructure, whether we have resources that we can develop for refining rare earth minerals, or whether we have the ability to use robotics to make important infrastructure investments in this country. I think it's absolutely critical, and I'm supportive, and I'm excited by the idea that we could figure out policies that will help redomesticate that type of work. I think it's a more complicated argument when you talk about things like steel manufacturing, or I grew up in Michigan. The US domestic auto market certainly, I think it falls into the category now, or it can partially fall into the category now, of advanced manufacturing. I think policies that are supportive of that are laudable. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity there.
So, looking beyond the first 100 days of the administration, what do you see as the biggest long term opportunities and risks for the power sector going forward, particularly with renewables, energy transition technologies? You mentioned green hydrogen earlier, clean fuels. Where do you see the biggest opportunities and risks?
Well, risk is very clearly the gambit that the administration is taking with respect to this trade war. I think I saw on the news that Scott Bessent believes that there will be a resolution to the trade war with China, apparently soon. I would love to see that. That would dramatically change the face of this administration and unlock a lot of opportunity. The bull case for everything is that there will be a reshuffling of the global economic order, and as soon as that is settled in whatever form it is, I think all of our clients will feel a lot more comfortable buckling down, figuring out how their supply chain works, figuring out how their cost of capital works in the new environment, and we will, get back to doing business. I think that the risk of not doing anything was also pretty significant, because I think that the global debt strategy that the United States had pursued could have also equally created a huge amount of risk for the ability of our economy to compete globally. And so I remain cautiously optimistic that all of these issues resolve in a positive way that helps our clients become very successful. Specific types of businesses or specific types of investments, I certainly think that given the administration's focus on a secure domestic supply chain and competitiveness when it comes to the cost of power or energy independence or the ability to compete on the AI stage, I think investments in, and this is a bit cliche, but I think investments in data centers and the power that supports those data centers is going to be incredibly important. I tend to take the view that regardless of whether the projections today about the need for more data centers are accurate or not, the need for power and just the appetite for more raw data, even if it's not the super sophisticated training data or AI, processor chips. Just everything in our economy is going to move to requiring more processing power and more electricity. It wouldn't surprise me if our toasters start having chips in them that are algorithmically determining whether the bread has been toasted properly. So I think everything in our economy, building management, traffic management, electrification of personal transportation, all of these things are going to create more demand that I think we actually are really in a demand growth cycle for the first meaningful time in 40 years.
Mhm.
So I think all of these opportunity sets to develop power assets that are tied to these trends are going to be extremely impactful. I will share some thoughts on green hydrogen and clean fuels, if you don't mind, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear your our viewpoint.
So green hydrogen is an interesting issue because a few years ago, there was so much energy around the idea that green hydrogen could be the new molecule based solution for US power. And interestingly enough, it seems to me that some of the policies that were put in place during the Biden administration seemed to completely dampen those expectations. And specifically I'm thinking of the tying of clean generation on a time basis to generation of hydrogen. We have clients who made investments in green hydrogen projects that are those investments are basically on hold because it's not economically feasible to take those steps to get the types of credits you would need to make those projects competitive in the market. There are certainly still plenty of use cases for green hydrogen or hydrogen in general, but for right now, it feels like the progress is sort of stopped. You don't hear any talk about development of new pipelines for a new hydrogen, economy, and I think that's a disappointment. I think that there's a lot of opportunities in starting to invest in that, and I hope it's something that the current administration takes a look at and see whether it fits into the broader spectrum of energy independence and things that make this country really competitive. Clean fuels, on the other hand, are a whole different ball of wax as far as I can tell. We've had a number of clients make investments in clean fuel projects, and in some ways, those projects, even though they are the beneficiaries of tax credits, seem to be much less tied to tax credits when investors and sponsors evaluate whether they think that these businesses are going to be productive or not, more economically viable or not. I found it very striking, actually. I heard an interview with the CEO of Exxon, which I think he was interviewed at the most recent COP. And he made it very clear that what he views as the oil majors' strategic advantage is a giant staff of the world's best engineers, and that they're going to continue figuring out the most economic, but also the least impactful from an environmental perspective ways they can. Now, I don't want to, I don't, I don't want to be snowed by an oil major making grand proclamations, but it was an interesting point, and I've seen it bear out in speaking with clients that have clean fuels businesses. They really are looking for ways to develop at all sorts of different scales fuels that require less scrubbing, that require less dirty transformations, but that can serve the same purpose as existing fuel sources. And it appears to be a very active industry. And so I'm somewhat optimistic that regardless of what the administration's policies are on supplementing the cost of those fuels, that we have a lot of really incredible engineers across this country who are figuring out ways to be very supportive of the clean fuels industry. And I look forward to seeing a lot more of that.
From your vantage point, how would you characterize the overall sentiment out there with your clients and what they think of the power sector right now? Is there fear? Is there optimism? Is there just kind of a wait and see attitude, or what are you hearing from your customers and clients?
I don't think there's fear, but I also don't think there's optimism right now. I think that there is a lot more wait and see attitude than anything else. Certainly in the M&A markets, transaction velocity has slowed. It doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of active engagements going on right now where people are selling portfolios of assets, whether they're development or existing. There are businesses that are testing the market, figuring out what their price points are. It's just much slower right now than it has been in the past. And I think that's very clearly driven by a difficulty in figuring out a strategy for how to value these assets and these businesses. So that's a bit slow. And I think at a certain point, everybody hopes that they will get a little bit more certainty at some point this summer and be able to start transacting again. If they don't, it has certainly been the sentiment that's been expressed to me that we have businesses to run. We got to start making judgment calls and start figuring out how we can transact in today's environment, even if with a lot of uncertainty. So we'll see how that goes in the long term.
Greg, I've taken a lot more of your time than I actually intended to, but you've shared some really insightful information with me, so I appreciate that. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you feel would be important to mention before we wrap up the podcast?
I think my overall view is that I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of incredible renewable energy developers and investors over the past decade. And what always strikes me about that industry more than any other industry, and I think this extends to some of the clean fuels or some of the energy transition market participants that we talked about on this call, but these people are first and foremost entrepreneurial. They are focused intently on figuring out ways to navigate an incredibly complex energy, power, and financial environment. And they have been for the past 10, 15, 20 years. There's barely been a single year that I can remember where I've been really focused on this industry, where there hasn't been some major shift in the landscape of how these types of projects are developed. And the market always finds a way through. So I personally am optimistic and excited about what the next phase of this entire marketplace is going to look like. I think that this country has incredible talent. I think that we have incredible technological advances that are going to prevail despite short-term static and noise in how we pursue development and growth in this country. And so I'm excited to see what happens. I am very hopeful that we can remove some of the turbulence in supply chains and uncertainty and get back to doing business. I personally am quite optimistic and very excited to continue working with our fantastic clients and to be able to have conversations with people like yourself, Aaron, about what the future holds and what we can be excited about.
Well, thanks again for your time, Greg. Again, for listeners, I've been speaking with Greg Levine. He is a partner with the global law firm Sidley Austin. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast, and maybe we'll get together again sometime.
I would look forward to that. Thanks so much, Aaron.